Listen carefully, because what I'm about to say might change the way you see love, connection, and power forever. Most people think avoidants are untouchable, cold, distant, impossible to reach, but that's not the truth. The truth is there is one type of empath, just one, who doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't lose themselves. And that person, they don't run after avoidance. They make avoidance come to them, not through manipulation, not through games, but through a level of emotional strength most people never develop. So if you've ever felt powerless in love, pay attention, because this might be the moment everything shifts for you. People think chasing is love. They think if they call more, text more, give more, prove more, somehow they'll finally be chosen. But that's not how human psychology works, especially not with someone who has an avoidant pattern. The moment you start chasing, you're not creating attraction, you're creating pressure. And pressure is exactly what makes an avoidant pull away. Understand this. When you chase, you're sending a message, I need you more than you need me. And the moment that imbalance is felt, the dynamic shifts. Not because you're not worthy, but because you've abandoned your own center. You've made someone else the source of your emotional stability. That's where you lose your power. See, attraction doesn't grow from desperation. It grows from certainty. It grows from presence. It grows from someone who stands grounded in who they are, whether someone stays or leaves. When you chase, you're no longer grounded or reacting. You're waiting for their reply to feel okay. You're overanalyzing their silence. You're giving your emotional control to someone else. And that energy, it feels immediately. An avoidant doesn't consciously say, oh, they're chasing me, I'll pull away. No, it's deeper than that. It's instinctive. They feel overwhelmed. They feel like their space is being invaded. And their natural response is to create distance. So the more you move toward them with urgency, the more they move away with resistance. But here's the shift hand. This is where everything changes. The moment you stop chasing is the moment you begin reclaiming yourself. It's the moment you say, my peace matters more than my need to be chosen. That's not ego. That's self-respect. Stopping the chase doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop overextending. It means you stop trying to convince someone to see your value. Because real value doesn't need convincing, it's felt. And it feels strongest when it's not forced. Think about it. The people who seem the most attractive, the most magnetic, are they the ones constantly trying to prove themselves? Or are they the ones who are comfortable in their own space, living their life, not needing approval to feel complete? That's the energy shift. That's what draws people in. When you stop chasing, you create space. And in that space, something powerful happens. The other person starts to feel your absence. Not because you disappeared, but because you're no longer flooding them with your presence. And that absence creates curiosity. It creates reflection. It gives them room to come toward you if they choose to. But more importantly, it gives you room to reconnect with yourself, to remember who you were before you started seeking validation, to rebuild your emotional independence. Because the truth is, the more you chase someone else, the further you drift away from yourself. And no relationship, no matter how intense, can thrive if you've lost yourself in the process. So you have to ask yourself a real question. Are you trying to be chosen, or are you choosing yourself? Because those are two completely different paths. One leads to anxiety, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion. The other leads to clarity, confidence, and genuine connection. When you choose yourself, your energy changes. Your posture changes. Your words carry weight again. You're no longer speaking from fear of losing someone. You're speaking from a place of knowing your worth. That's the energy that shifts everything. Because now if someone pulls away, you don't chase, you observe. You don't panic, you stay centered. You don't try to fix it too, let it reveal itself. And in doing that, you naturally create a new dynamic. One where respect replaces pressure, where attraction replaces tension. The irony is the moment you stop chasing is often the moment they start noticing. Not because you played a game, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. You step back into your power. And power, real power, is quiet. It doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It simply stands, grounded and certain. It lets the right things come closer. That's the shift. That's where you win. Most people believe that love is about giving more and more time, more energy, more attention. They think if they become everything the other person needs, they'll finally be valued, chosen, secured. But that belief is exactly what keeps them stuck in cycles of emotional dependency. Because the truth is, the more you need someone to feel whole, the more pressure you put on the connection, and the less attractive your energy becomes. Emotional self-sufficiency flips that entire dynamic. It's the ability to feel complete within yourself, regardless of who stays or leaves. It doesn't mean you don't care, and it doesn't mean you isolate yourself from connection. It means your sense of identity, worth, and peace is not dependent on another person's presence, attention, or approval. And that kind of energy is rare. Powerful, and it's deeply magnetic. When you're emotionally self-sufficient, you don't enter relationships looking to be filled, you enter them already full. You're not trying to extract validation, you're expressing who you are. That difference changes everything. Because now, instead of saying, I need you to complete me, your energy says, I choose you, but I don't rely on you to feel okay. And that creates a sense of safety, especially for someone who fears being overwhelmed. Avoidant personalities, in particular, are highly sensitive to emotional dependence. The moment they feel like someone is leaning on them too heavily for emotional stability, they instinctively pull back. Not because they don't feel anything, but because it triggers their fear of losing autonomy. But when they encounter someone who is grounded, centered, and emotionally independent, something shifts. There's no pressure to perform, no expectation to constantly reassure, just space. And that space feels safe. And safety is what allows connection to grow. But the difference between someone who texts you constantly, needs reassurance every day, and reacts emotionally to every delay versus someone who is consistent, calm, and secure in themselves. One creates tension, the other creates ease. One feels like responsibility, the other feels like freedom. And people naturally move toward what feels lighter, not heavier. Emotional self-sufficiency also means you're not afraid of silence. You're not interpreting every pause as rejection. You're not spiraling when things slow down. Instead, you remain steady. You trust your own life. You stay engaged in your own purpose, your own growth, your own routines. And that steadiness becomes your strength because now you're no longer reacting, you're choosing. You're no longer trying to control the outcome, you're allowing things to unfold. And that shift from control to trust creates a completely different presence. It's grounded. It's calm. It's confident without needing to prove anything. And here's the paradox. When you need someone less, they often feel you more. Why? Because your energy is no longer clouded by anxiety. It's clear. It's open. It invites connection instead of demanding it. And that invitation is far more powerful than any attempt to hold on tightly. But let's be real, this isn't easy. Emotional self-sufficiency requires you to face your own patterns. It requires you to sit with your discomfort instead of escaping it through someone else. It requires you to build a relationship with yourself that is strong enough to stand on its own. And most people avoid that work, which is why they stay stuck in cycles of chasing, overgiving, and feeling unfulfilled. You have to learn how to validate yourself, how to calm yourself, how to enjoy your own company without constantly needing distraction or reassurance. Because when you can do that, you stop seeking someone to fix your emotions and start inviting someone to share your life. That's a completely different foundation. Now, when you show up in a relationship, you're not bringing neediness, you're bringing presence. You're not bringing fear, you're bringing stability. And that stability is what creates attraction that lasts, not just sparks that fade. You also become more discerning. Because when you're emotionally self-sufficient, you're not willing to accept just any connection. You're not tolerating inconsistency or disrespect just to avoid being alone. You're choosing based on alignment, not desperation. And that alone raises your value. The most magnetic person in any room is not the one trying the hardest to be seen. It's the one who is completely at ease with themselves. The one who doesn't need approval to feel worthy. The one who knows that their life is already full, and anyone who enters it is an addition, not a necessity. That's the energy that draws people in. Not because it's loud, but because it's solid. It doesn't waver. It doesn't collapse under uncertainty. It remains steady, regardless of external circumstances. And when you reach that level, something shifts internally. You stop asking, do they want me? And start asking, do I want this? You stop fearing loss and start valuing alignment. You stop trying to hold on and start allowing the right things to stay naturally. That's what makes emotional self-sufficiency so powerful. It doesn't just change how others see you, it changes how you see yourself. And once that shift happens, you're no longer chasing connection, you're attracting it. Most people misunderstand boundaries. They think boundaries push people away, create distance, or make them seem cold. But the truth is the opposite. Boundaries are what create respect. Without them, there is no structure, no clarity, no sense of where you stand. And when there's no clarity, people don't value the connection. They take it for granted. When you don't set boundaries, what you're really doing is saying, I will tolerate whatever you give me. You might not say it out loud, but your actions communicate it clearly. You accept late replies without question, inconsistent behavior without consequence, emotional unavailability without addressing it. And over time, that tolerance becomes the standard, not because the other person is trying to disrespect you, but because you've shown them that this is what you accept. Avoidants, in particular, respond strongly to this dynamic. If there are no clear limits, they drift further into their comfort zone of more space, less communication, less emotional engagement. Not out of malice, but because nothing is pulling them back into balance. There's no resistance, no structure, no signal that something needs to change. This is where boundaries shift everything. A boundary is not a demand. It's not controlling someone else's behavior. It's a decision about what you will and will not accept and what you will do if that line is crossed. That's a powerful distinction. Because now, instead of trying to change someone, you're defining yourself. For example, instead of saying, you need to text me more, a boundary sounds like consistency matters to me, and I don't stay in connections where communication is unclear. One tries to control. The other expresses a standard, and standards create respect. Why? Because they show that you value yourself. When you communicate a boundary calmly without anger or desperation, you're sending a clear message. I know what I deserve, and I'm not afraid to stand by it. That kind of certainty is rare. And people feel it immediately. There's no confusion, no mixed signals, just clarity. And clarity does something powerful. It removes ambiguity. The other person knows exactly where you stand. They can either meet you there or not. But either way, the dynamic becomes honest. Now, here's where most people go wrong. They either avoid setting boundaries out of fear of losing the person, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as too much, or they set boundaries in an emotional, reactive way through frustration, ultimatums, or passive-aggressive behavior. And both approaches weaken their position. Real boundaries are calm. They're grounded. They don't come from a place of anger. They come from a place of self-respect. When you set a boundary from that place, you're not trying to force an outcome. You're simply stating a truth about yourself, and that truth becomes the foundation of the relationship. Avoidants, interestingly, often respond better to this than to emotional pressure. When you push them emotionally, they retreat. But when you stand firm, without chasing, without over-explaining, something shifts. They begin to see that this connection has structure. Your presence is not something they can take for granted, and that's when respect starts to grow. Because respect is not built on how much you give, it's built on how clearly you define your limits. It's built on consistency between your words and your actions. If you say something matters to you but don't follow through, the message gets diluted. But when your actions align with your standards, your presence gains weight. And that weight changes how people treat you. It's important to understand that boundaries also protect your emotional energy. Without them, you're constantly adjusting, accommodating, overextending. You're giving more than you receive, hoping it will eventually balance out, but it rarely does. Instead, you become drained, resentful, and disconnected from yourself. Boundaries stop that cycle. They create a filter. They ensure that only behavior aligned with your values is allowed to stay, and anything that doesn't align naturally falls away. That's not loss, that's alignment. And yes, sometimes setting a boundary means someone pulls back or even walks away, but that doesn't mean the boundary was wrong. It means the connection couldn't meet your standard. And holding on to something that doesn't meet your standard is what truly costs you. So you have to decide, are you trying to keep someone at any cost? Or are you building something that actually works for you? Because those are two very different approaches. One sacrifices your needs to maintain the connection. The other builds a connection that respects your needs from the start. When you operate from the second approach, your entire energy shifts. You're no longer negotiating your worth. You're expressing it. You're no longer hoping to be respected. You're creating the conditions where respect is required. And that's what makes boundaries so powerful. They don't push people away, they reveal who is willing to meet you at your level. They don't create distance, they create clarity. And in that clarity, the right kind of connection can finally grow. Because at the end of the day, people don't respect what you say, they respect what you consistently stand for. Most people think intensity creates connection. They believe if they express more emotion, react more strongly, or show how deeply they feel, it will pull the other person closer. But in reality, emotional chaos does the opposite. It creates instability. And instability pushes people, especially avoidants, further away. When your energy is reactive, unpredictable, or overwhelming, it doesn't feel like love, it feels like pressure. It feels like something that needs to be managed, responded to, or fixed. And no one wants to feel like they're constantly responsible for regulating someone else's emotions. That's not connection, that's emotional weight. Calm energy, on the other hand, is powerful in a completely different way. It doesn't demand attention, it commands respect. It doesn't overwhelm, it stabilizes. And that stability is what creates a sense of safety, which is the foundation of any real connection. Think about how you feel around someone who is constantly anxious, overthinking, reacting to every small shift. There's tension in the air. You feel like you have to be careful, like one wrong move might trigger something. Now, compare that to someone who is grounded, steady, and emotionally in control. There's ease. There's space. You can breathe around them. That difference is everything. Avoidants are especially sensitive to emotional intensity. The moment things feel chaotic or unpredictable, their instinct is to pull back and regain control of their space. Not because they don't care, but because their system is wired to avoid overwhelm. So when you respond with heightened emotion, multiple messages, long explanations, visible frustration, you're unintentionally reinforcing their need to distance themselves. But when you stay calm, you interrupt that pattern. Calm energy doesn't mean you suppress your feelings. It means you regulate them. It means you take responsibility for your emotional state instead of projecting it outward. You feel what you feel, but you don't let it control your behavior. And that level of control sends a powerful message. I am stable. I am grounded. I am not here to create chaos. That message is deeply attractive because now, instead of reacting impulsively, you respond intentionally. Instead of escalating tension, you diffuse it. Instead of feeding into uncertainty, you bring clarity. And that makes the interaction feel safe, even in moments of disagreement or distance. Calm energy also creates mystery. When you're constantly reacting, you become predictable in a way that reduces intrigue. The other person knows exactly how you'll respond, and often that response is driven by emotion rather than intention. But when you're calm, composed, and measured, there's a level of control that draws attention. People start to wonder what you're thinking, how you're processing, what your next move will be. And that curiosity pulls them in. It's important to understand that calmness is not weakness. In fact, it's the opposite. It takes strength to stay centered when everything inside you wants to react. It takes discipline to pause, to breathe, to choose your response instead of being driven by impulse. Most people don't have that control, which is why they get caught in cycles of emotional highs and lows. But when you develop that control, you become different. You become someone who doesn't get pulled into emotional turbulence. Someone who can hold space without losing themselves. And that presence becomes a grounding force in the relationship. Now, this doesn't mean you never express emotion. It means you express it with intention. You communicate clearly, without blame or intensity. You say what you feel, but you don't attach urgency or pressure to it. You allow the other person to receive it, process it, and respond in their own time. That kind of communication builds trust because it shows that you're not trying to control the outcome, you're simply being honest while remaining grounded. And that balance is rare. Most people either suppress their emotions completely or express them in ways that create tension. Finding that middle ground is what sets you apart. Calm energy also protects you. When you're reactive, you're vulnerable to every external shift. A delayed message can change your mood. A slight change in tone can trigger doubt. But when you're grounded, those external factors lose their power. You remain steady, regardless of what's happening around you. And that steadiness becomes your strength. Because now, you're not being pulled in different directions by someone else's behavior. You're anchored in yourself. You observe without immediately reacting. You process before responding. And that creates a sense of control, not over the other person, but over yourself. That's real power. And here's the irony. The calmer you become, the more others feel your presence. Not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. There's no noise, no confusion, no emotional clutter. Just a steady, grounded energy that people can't quite explain, but they're drawn to it. So instead of trying to create connection through intensity, shift your focus to stability. Instead of reacting to every change, become the constant. Because in a world where most people are driven by emotion, the one who remains calm stands out the most. And that's the energy that changes everything. Most people are afraid of being scarce. They think if they're not constantly present, constantly available, constantly giving attention, they'll be forgotten. They believe love is maintained through continuous access always, replying, always showing up, always making themselves reachable. But what they don't realize is that constant availability doesn't increase value. It often diminishes it. When something is always there, always accessible, always guaranteed, the mind stops recognizing its significance. It becomes predictable, familiar, expected. And what's expected is rarely appreciated at the same level as what feels limited or intentional. This isn't about playing games, it's about understanding human nature. People value what they feel they could lose. Scarcity in this sense is not about disappearing or creating artificial distance. It's about having a life that doesn't revolve entirely around one person. It's about valuing your own time, your own energy, your own priorities. When your world is full, when you have goals, routines, passions, and purpose, you naturally become less available. Not because you're trying to be, but because your life has depth beyond the connection. And that depth is attractive. When you're always available, you unintentionally communicate that your time has no structure, that your energy is open-ended, that your focus can be shifted instantly depending on someone else's presence. And while that might seem like dedication, it often reads as a lack of boundaries and self-priority. On the other hand, when you value your time, you become selective. You don't respond instantly to everything. You don't drop everything at a moment's notice. You engage when it aligns, not when it's demanded. And that creates a different kind of presence, one that feels intentional rather than automatic. Avoidants especially respond to this shift. When someone is always there, always reaching out, always initiating, it removes the need for them to step forward. The dynamic becomes one-sided. But when your presence becomes less predictable, not in a manipulative way, but in a natural, grounded way, they begin to feel the difference. They notice the space. And in that space, curiosity begins to grow. Because now, instead of being constantly engaged, they have moments where they wonder about you, where they think about your absence, where they feel the shift in energy. And that feeling is what often pulls them forward. Not because you forced it, but because you allowed room for it to happen. Scarcity also creates respect. When you don't treat your time as unlimited, others begin to recognize its value. They start to understand that your presence is something to be appreciated, not assumed. And that changes how they show up. They become more intentional, more aware, more engaged. But this only works if it's real. If you try to manufacture scarcity through games, ignoring messages intentionally, creating distance just to provoke a reaction, it loses its authenticity. And people can feel that. True scarcity comes from a place of alignment, not strategy. It comes from genuinely having a life that matters to you, independently of the relationship. It's about saying, without words, my time is important, my energy is valuable, and I choose where I invest it. That mindset shifts everything. Because now you're not trying to hold someone's attention, you're offering your presence. And there's a difference. One is driven by fear of losing, the other by confidence in your own value. When you operate from that confidence, you stop overextending. You stop saying yes to everything. You stop prioritizing someone else at the cost of yourself. And instead, you create a balance where both people contribute, both people invest, both people show up. That balance is what creates sustainable attraction. Scarcity also protects you from burnout. When you're constantly available, constantly giving, you eventually drain yourself. You lose your energy, your focus, your sense of self. And the connection starts to feel heavy instead of fulfilling. But when you manage your time and energy with intention, you preserve your capacity to show up fully when it matters. You become more present, not less, because you're not stretched thin. You're not overwhelmed. You're choosing your moments, and that choice brings quality into the interaction. There's also a psychological shift that happens within you. When you stop being constantly available, you begin to reconnect with your own life. You invest in your growth, your goals, your environment. You build a sense of fulfillment that doesn't rely on constant interaction. And that internal fulfillment changes how you show up externally. You're no longer seeking attention, you're sharing your time. And that's what makes the difference. Because people can feel when your life is full. They can sense when you're grounded in your own world. And that energy is naturally attractive. It doesn't chase, it draws. It doesn't demand, it invites. So instead of trying to be more available, focus on being more intentional. Instead of giving your time freely, give it meaning. Because when your presence is not guaranteed, it becomes valuable. And when it becomes valuable, it gets noticed. Most people enter relationships trying to win the other person over. They focus on being liked, being chosen, being enough for someone else. They adjust their behavior, soften their standards, and slowly reshape themselves to fit what they think the other person wants. And in that process, they lose something essential, their sense of self. The real shift happens when you stop trying to be the one who wins and start becoming the one worth winning. That doesn't come from arrogance. It doesn't come from thinking you're better than others. It comes from building a life, a mindset, and a presence that you genuinely respect. It's about becoming someone who doesn't need external validation to feel valuable because your value is already established from within. When you're trying to win someone, your energy is outward focused. You're watching their reactions, analyzing their behavior, adjusting your approach. You're constantly asking, am I doing enough? Do they like me? What can I do better? And that mindset creates pressure. It puts you in a position where your worth feels conditional, dependent on their response. But when you become the prize, that energy flips inward. You start asking different questions. Does this align with me? Do I feel respected here? Is this connection adding to my life? You're no longer chasing approval, you're evaluating compatibility. And that shift changes everything. Because now you're not trying to impress, you're expressing. You're not hiding parts of yourself to be accepted, you're showing up fully and allowing the right people to connect with that. There's a level of honesty in your presence that doesn't need to be filtered or adjusted. And that authenticity is what creates real attraction. People are drawn to those who are comfortable in their own identity. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. There's no performance, no constant need to prove something. Just a steady sense of self that doesn't fluctuate based on external feedback. Avoidants, in particular, respond differently to this kind of energy. When someone is trying to win them, it often triggers distance. It feels like expectation, like pressure to meet a certain standard or fulfill a certain role. But when someone shows up grounded, self-assured, and independent of the outcome, it removes that pressure. There's nothing to resist. Instead, there's curiosity. There's space to engage without feeling controlled. And that's where the dynamic begins to shift. Because now they're not being pursued, they're being invited into something stable, something balanced. Becoming the prize also means raising your standards, not in a rigid or unrealistic way, but in a clear and consistent way. You stop accepting behavior that doesn't align with your values. You stop justifying inconsistency or emotional unavailability. And you stop holding on to potential instead of reality. That clarity creates a different kind of presence. You're no longer negotiating your needs or honoring them. And that sends a strong message. I know what I bring and I know what I deserve. That message doesn't need to be spoken. It's felt through your actions, your boundaries, your choices. And it changes how people respond to you. Because when you value yourself, others are more likely to value you too. Not because they're forced to, but because your energy sets the tone. You're not asking for respect, you're embodying it. And that makes it easier for others to meet you at that level. There's also a sense of freedom that comes with this shift. When you're trying to win someone, you're constantly managing the outcome. You're attached to how things unfold. But when you become the prize, you release that attachment. You allow the connection to develop naturally without forcing it. You understand that the right person will recognize your value without needing to be convinced. And if they don't, it's not a reflection of your worth, it's a mismatch in alignment. That perspective removes a lot of emotional weight. You're no longer trying to make something work at all costs. You're allowing what works to stay and what doesn't to fall away. And in that process, you create space for connections that are genuinely aligned with who you are. Becoming the prize also requires consistency. It's not just about how you feel in one moment, it's about how you show up over time. It's about maintaining your standards even when it's uncomfortable. It's about choosing yourself even when part of you wants to go back to old patterns. That consistency builds trust not just with others, but with yourself. You begin to rely on your own decisions. You trust your own judgment. And that internal trust becomes the foundation of your confidence. It's no longer dependent on external validation. It's rooted in your own experience of showing up for yourself. And that kind of confidence is steady. It doesn't spike and crash based on someone else's behavior. It remains grounded regardless of the situation. That's what makes it powerful. Because when you operate from that place, you're not easily shaken. You don't lose yourself in uncertainty. You don't abandon your standards for temporary connection. You remain aligned with who you are. And that alignment becomes your strength. At that point, you're not chasing, you're attracting. You're not proving, you're allowing. You're not trying to be enough, you already are. And that's the moment the dynamic truly shifts. Because the person who once felt out of reach begins to feel your absence, your presence, your value in a different way. Not because you changed them, but because you changed how you show up. You became someone who doesn't need to be chosen because you've already chosen yourself.